April, and I'm delighted to introduce on the current today Rachel Vogelstein and Meighan Stone. Both are senior fellows at the Council on Foreign Relations, and they are jointly the authors of Awakening, Me Too, and the Global Fight for Women's Rights. Hello, Rachel. Hello, Meighan. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So I wanted to start our conversation today by having you take us back to the beginning of the Me Too movement for both of you. We might think of it as being something that was related to the election in 2016, but maybe that's not exactly how it arrived in your consciousness. So when does Me Too start for you?
Well, Me Too, the hashtag movement that we know of here in the United States, really started back in 2006 with the civil rights activist Tarana Burke, who was counseling women in her community and hearing about experiences of sexual harassment and abuse, and sat there thinking, me too, these experiences had happened to her as well. And she wanted to help others feel that they were in community with women who had had similar experiences. And that phrase, Me Too, then turns into a hashtag that we know goes global, starting in the United States in 2017, and then continuing on to more than 100 countries today. But in many of the countries that we profile in Awakening, the Me Too hashtag is not the beginning of the movement. And in fact, women's activism long predates the rise of the Me Too hashtag in the United States. In Brazil, for example, years before the Me Too hashtag went viral, women in Brazil were tweeting under a different hashtag, Meu Primeiro Assédio, which means my first harassment, to combat and raise awareness about the issue of sexual abuse in that country.
But for you personally, when did it become a political issue that you felt was deserving of a significant amount of your career attention for both of you? You're both very engaged. You work inside government. You work as activists. So when was the moment when you knew that this was, in part, your cause?
For me, that moment was definitely just experiences over years, honestly. It wasn't one moment, it was many. It was interacting with women, human rights defenders, and activists in my work from all over the world and having them confide in me more times than I can count that they themselves had been victims of sexual assault, sexual harassment, at the hands of family members, people in their community, religious leaders. It had been in direct retaliation for their activism. We actually saw this in the recent Hong Kong democracy protests, that women there who were part of those protests and calling for their rights to have a free and open society found that when they were arrested, they were sexually harassed and assaulted as part of political intimidation. And so this is actually something that if you worked in this space, you heard women talking about, but it wasn't often something that women would talk about like on the stage at a big event celebrating human rights. It was something that a woman might confide in you quietly after you had really built a relationship and got to know each other. And it was just another piece of how hard it is to be a woman who's a human rights defender. And so, for me, seeing the linkage, that this was absolutely a place where women were experiencing real and profound subjugation, and it was really being used as a tool to push them out of the marketplace, push them out of the political space, push them out of power. And, how can you start to surface that and say, actually, women's rights are human rights? And that includes the right to have safety in our bodies and our very selves, right? And to not experience, whether it's anything from sexual assault to silence you, if you're calling for a transparent government or to take down a totalitarian, or if you simply want to be the first woman in your family to have a job and be able to work at a newspaper or work in an office or work at any kind of place of employment. And so, it became really clear this was something that was central to women's equity, and this was a big part of the fight.
The great thing about your book is that you take the story that perhaps we know a little bit about in America, and you throw open the doors to stories from around the world. And it's a unique kind of global gathering of women's voices and experiences that the book offers. I wondered if you saw any sort of patterns in terms of what were different priorities in different parts of the world in terms of where the Me Too movement goes. Of course, there's a sort of fundamental commonality in, as you say, wanting to argue for the respect and protection of women's bodies and women's basic rights. But do you find that different countries are in different places when it's in terms of what they're trying to accomplish, and how does that express itself?
What we found in our travels and in our research was that the movement is simultaneously transnational and also at the same time hyper-localized. It's transnational in that activists are connecting with one another across borders using 21st century tools, social media, smartphones, the internet, that have accelerated not only the pace of the movement, but also its inclusivity. And we see that women are able to use the Me Too hashtag, which is translated into dozens of languages, to share a universality, a common experience of harassment, abuse, and discrimination. But at the same time, the movement was also hyper-localized. Leaders were able to transform the movement to apply specifically to the context in which women find themselves in particular nations, particular religions, social contexts. And we see that the movement, as a result, looks different in different parts of the world. So, for example, activists in China were combating not only the scourge of sexual harassment and discrimination, they were doing so in the context of fighting against censorship. And so they had to be incredibly not only courageous, but also creative in coming up with ways to get around the censors. In one instance, they got around the text-based ban on the hashtag #MeToo by using images. In this case, an image of a rice bowl, which is pronounced me, and a bunny, which is pronounced too. And I think Meighan had a similar experience traveling to different countries, seeing that the movement looked different in different places.
It absolutely did. In Nigeria, in the north, they customized the hashtag by calling it Ariwa Me Too. And Ariwa is just the word in Hausa for north, for the northern part of Nigeria. And I think this gets to, there's sometimes questions about, at least in a US context, whatever happened to the Me Too movement? Was it successful? Was it just women in the street expressing outrage, or did it have real concrete gains? Did it fizzle out? And what we wanted to find and get to the bottom of in this book was, what were the answers to those questions? And what we found is, if you start looking for hashtags in other languages that maybe you don't know what the Me Too hashtag might be in Egyptian Arabic, maybe you don't know what it might be in Urdu or in Hausa in Nigeria. But if you go looking for that, you find that this movement online is very vibrant and continues going. So our analysis now is just these first couple of years of the movement. Even today, there's stories constantly that are coming up in different countries, calling powerful men to account in government, in business, in faith communities. And so if you know what to look for, you find this movement is continuing to achieve real victories.
Do you think it's as it were cross-pollinating? Are the successes outside of the US going to feed back into the movement here, and indeed, of course, in other countries?
We think that we have a lot to learn here in the United States from the movements being waged in other countries. We make a point in the book that we are not writing about the heroic arrival of Western feminism to other nations. In most of the countries we went to, women have long organized for their own equality, many of them using online tools that predate the popularization of the Me Too hashtag here in the United States. We have a lot to learn, I think, is the bottom line. And I'll give an example in Sweden, which is often thought of as the most gender equal country in the world. There was a huge movement and a revelation about the scale of harassment and abuse and discrimination that continues even in that country. And women in Sweden decided against publicly outing individual men who harassed and assaulted them, instead choosing to amass their stories anonymously online in order to increase the number of women coming forward and to emphasize that this is not about a few individual bad apples, but instead is a form of systemic discrimination. And activists were incredibly clever. They organized across 65 different industries in Sweden using humorous hashtags that helped the movement go and stay viral. For example, restaurant workers posted under the hashtag that translates to "We are boiling with rage." And then healthcare workers posted under a hashtag that translates to "Now it will really hurt." Unions used "not negotiable," and on and on. And so I think the bottom line is that all of us, in whichever country we reside, have work to do and can learn from the tactics employed by women in other countries.
I'll just add, when I wrote that line, that it's not about the heroic arrival of white Western feminism to these countries. It's making the point that the change that needs to happen in other countries sometimes overlaps with what we see in the United States, and sometimes needs to be very different, and rightly so, right? We need to really empower, trust, support local women leaders in these countries for what they know needs to shift in their communities, and to do it in the way that makes sense to them, because these are the women who are going to be in those communities long term, right? They are the ones most invested in that change. And so we need to take our cues from them. And, the book really tries to chronicle and center their stories instead of us prescribing what we think needs to shift in terms of what's happening in another country. That's not our role. I think it's overdue. We say in foreign policy, it's really not our place. And then we need to trust local leaders to do what they only know how to do.
So it's amazing in some ways that the movement has spread to 100 countries, but then you think, there's probably another 100 countries, nations that are recognized in the world where presumably it hasn't, and that's kind of terrifying. So where are the spaces where so far this movement, this assertiveness on behalf of the rights of women has yet to be allowed to flower?
Well, I think the thesis of our book and what our research showed is that this truly is a global movement. The Me Too hashtag has been searched in all 193 countries across the globe. It certainly looks different in different corners of the world. And in terms of the pace of change, certainly we see great variation. But even in nations where women haven't yet won legal or legislative victories, we still see that Me Too is helping to disrupt the stigma surrounding sexual assault and harassment in places that would really surprise you and in ways that have shifted the culture. So in Senegal, for example, 2 women in Dakar started a hashtag that translates from Wolof to "I will not shut up" to encourage women to speak out about harassment and assault. And they received a flood of private messages from women around the country, almost all saying it was the first time they'd ever spoken about their experiences or demanded justice. So we really believe that this new wave of voices cannot be easily quieted.
I wanted to ask you now about the role of America and Me Too. As you say, we're not trying to export a program here, but at the same time, we have a responsibility in terms of our global positioning and our global prominence to set an example. And in some cases, if we retreat, we might arguably be contributing to the other problem, which is that things get worse for women. Situation in Afghanistan right now looks very bad for the country. Looks going to be breaking into pieces again, and there'll be local sources of power rather than a national government. Do you have concerns that if we retreat in terms of our global role, that we make movements like Me Too much harder to sustain?
There's no doubt that America serves a really important role as a global leader, and I think the key is, how do we balance that well? How do we know where our place is to actually be of support and not to prescribe, right? Those are two different things. If someone comes to you and says, "Hey, Clive, I really want to help you with what you've identified as being most important to you. How can I support you? You tell me." That feels really different from me coming in and being like, "Hey, Clive, listen, this is what you're going to do. And I'm prescribing it, and it has to happen on this timeline in my way, or the highway." That's not a way to actually have real focused collaboration that I believe results in systemic change. That's not the way it should be done. And honestly is indicative of an old way of working that I think our field in foreign policy and international development is finally just beginning to grapple with, in terms of this post-colonial approach, right? Coming in as if we know best. We really don't. We really don't. What we can do is invest in local leaders. And that is a place where the United States can play a really powerful role. Right now, globally, less than 1 penny of every dollar, so I'll say that again, less than 1 penny of every dollar goes to women's rights organizations, women's organizations locally in countries, which is just kind of a shocking statistic when you think about women make up, obviously, at least half of the population. So why are we investing so little in women's organizations? We would argue systemic gender inequality, but that's something that we can actually change. And most activists will say policy means nothing unless you show me the money. You actually show that you're willing to invest in the change. It's not enough to just say the right things like, "You go girl," and "we support women," and "women are phenomenal." great, we agree. But what are you really going to do? And so the US can actually increase the amount of money we spend in foreign aid to support these women. And the other thing we can do, at least in the chapters that I wrote about in places like Egypt, where we're dealing with the Al-Sisi regime, which is a totalitarian regime. Right now, there's over 40,000 political prisoners in jail in Egypt, and female activists there, including those part of Me Too, have been under house arrest. They've been charged with things like the irresponsible liberation of women, literally a charge that was levied in a courtroom, and they've had their bank accounts frozen. We look at Saudi Arabia, the women that advocated for the right for women to drive there after MBS announced that he would be granting this right, were immediately jailed, and many of them alleged torture, right? However, these two leaders are welcomed to Washington, D.C. Even in the last 3 weeks, there's been high-level representatives from both governments coming to the U.S., and we continue to give them hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So I think it's a fair question. It doesn't really matter who's in the White House, whether they're on your side or the other. Like, let's all work together, and make sure that we're furthering human rights. Why are we spending so much of our U.S. taxpayer dollars to prop up and support regimes that are, just flagrant abusers of human rights, particularly for women? I think it's an important question.
I'm also interested to know whether in the course of, especially the discussions that you've had within the Council on Foreign Relations, who are a supporter of the book, and we're very happy that they are, whether you've heard an equivalent argument to the one that the West Wing promulgated a few years ago through the character of Ainsley Hayes, who said she didn't need the Equal Rights Amendment. She made the case that she had a citizen of the country, and I quote, she said, "I'm not a special subset in need of protection." She has other laws, in other words. Do you find in government that that argument persists, or is that now feeling like it belongs in the 1990s, when I think that episode was probably filmed, and that we have a different understanding of the role of government in terms of supporting women here and elsewhere?
Well, I'm a big fan of The West Wing, but I will say that that particular episode and line to me feels extremely dated. Our book details how structural inequalities and power imbalances, which are fueled by sexual harassment and discrimination, but also reach into other areas of our lives, undermine women's participation across economic, political, and social life. And there's plenty of evidence that closing these gender gaps is not only a moral imperative, it's a strategic imperative. It's one that furthers prosperity and stability and security, both at home and around the world. Take the issue of economic growth. Closing gender gaps in the workforce would generate an estimated $12 to $25 trillion in global GDP growth. So think about that at a time, particularly now, when we're struggling to recover from the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We're leaving trillions of dollars of economic potential on the table. So to me, the question is not as much, are there sufficient laws on the books already to ensure women's equality? We know that's not the case in most countries in the world. There's over 100 countries in the world that fail to have a legal level playing field for women and men in the workforce. But even in places with strong laws like the United States or a country like Sweden, which we write about, there are still deep structural inequalities that show that women have less power in the workplace. And that imbalance redounds to the detriment of all of us.
So I wanted to ask about another sort of structural feature which plays very differently depending on where you look. And it's one that I know you, especially Meighan, have had personal experience of, and that is the role of faith in terms of faith communities and how they can be either supportive or not supportive of the role of women. Talk a little bit about that in terms of what you've experienced, what the women in your book have experienced, whether they have found supportive assistance from faith communities, or whether they found that faith communities are part of the problem.
Yeah, I feel like any good solution in any country where there's a strong set of faith communities, and maybe one that's a majority and some other minority faith communities, but you have to engage them. You have to engage them. These are the places where people are getting married, having children, mourning the death of loved ones, showing up and trying to get teaching that they believe will illuminate their life or inform the most important decisions that they're going to make. So if we don't engage these communities, we're missing out on a really important opportunity to actually foster change, right? I think it's really important to approach this work with humility. I've worked a lot with the Muslim community. I used to be the president of Malala's Foundation, the Malala Fund, and continue to work with human rights activists in majority Muslim countries. And I'm always the first to remind my fellow Americans about what my own church background looked like in the United States, and that I have many friends who share my own faith who are parts of congregations where women to this day are not allowed to speak, they're not allowed to preach, they're not allowed to hold the position of pastor or minister. I say in the book that myself, when I went to relationship and marriage classes as a younger woman in my conservative church, I was told that it was God's will for me to submit to my husband. My pastor told me that point blank, right? So, I think we have to be really careful and come with this spirit of humility about that. It's not just in countries that are majority other faiths that we see these challenges. These challenges are right here at home as well. And, we found that women, for example, in the north of Nigeria, where, Islam is the predominant faith, that those women were able to do outreach with leaders, local imams, and other people in the faith community there to start to talk about what does the Quran actually say about women. Let's discuss, let's look at the text together. They also received threats, that they were not being good Muslim women for speaking out. They weren't demonstrating traditional values. And, that can happen. In the south of Nigeria, different faith contexts, majority Christian. We talked to women who came forward and made allegations against celebrity Christian evangelical church pastors there for abusing their role. And in one case, allegations that a pastor had actually sexually assaulted an underage young woman as part of allegedly a pattern, And so we saw here were women in the north who were from a very different context than women in the south, but they came together across faith lines to join together in a localized Me Too campaign that was very successful. So I think we can work together. I think there's a commonality that women experience, unfortunately. I don't think you can be a woman and not have either experienced this yourself or know someone that has, whether that's in your family, a friend, maybe you've seen it in your office or in your working life. So I think that women have a lot more sisterhood around this than some of the geopolitical differences that policymakers are quick to point to.
You mentioned that America is a country of strong laws, like most of Europe and indeed many other places around the world. Sometimes, though, it even seems as though the laws don't quite do the job. And I'm wondering what lessons we draw from the fact that Bill Cosby's convictions were overturned recently. That seems very strange to me.
Well, our view, and we wrote about this recently in the Washington Post, our view on the Bill Cosby release is that to evaluate the strength of this global movement only through the lens of the consequences on one famous American man would really be a mistake. We know that Bill Cosby's case was flipped on a procedural technicality, not because the women who came forward, the more than 60 women who came forward, weren't believed. And we see that Me Too continues to have a profound impact on the lives of women, not only in the United States, but all around the world. That said, legal reform and changing the criminal justice system so that women can actually obtain redress is one of the chief recommendations that we make in the book as to how we can help turn protest into progress. Redress, or justice for survivors of sexual assault and harassment, was at the top of the agenda of almost every Me Too activist we interviewed. For centuries, people accused of sexual abuse, especially those with the most power, have had the legal system tipped in their favor, while the reputations and integrity of survivors have been put on trial. And this injustice helps explain why, before the online Me Too movement could offer both anonymity and strength in numbers, so few women were willing to come forward to name what was plainly happening all around us. And we know that whether it's the United States of America or Egypt or China or Brazil, in all of the countries that we've written about and the country in which we live, we know that delivering justice for survivors will require reform. It requires protecting the rights of the accused, to be sure, but also the rights of survivors and freedom from discrimination and stereotypes about women.
What does redress look like?
Well, as a first step, we recommend that governments need to ensure that adequate legal protections against harassment and assault are in place in every country. 3 years into the Me Too movement, an astounding 50 countries still have no prohibitions on sexual harassment in the workplace. And even where there are laws prohibiting sexual abuse on the books, too often they're written in a way that prevents justice for women. Statutes of limitations, for example, which in this country continue to keep women outside of court and far from justice. So we need legislators to eliminate rules that rig the system against survivors and shield abusers from accountability.
To just want the system to work. What does this practically look like? Say I'm sexually harassed in my workplace. There was an example in Egypt, Maya al-Shami, one of the first women to actually bring a workplace harassment case against her employer for groping her at work. What kind of barriers did she face? Well, it turns out, there was a camera that was recording footage that day, and just so happens that footage was lost. Just so happens that the newspaper where she worked was a state-supported, very powerful media outlet. So guess what? There was no chance that the Egyptian legal system was going to work to protect her interests. And this is what happens. And we know this in the United States as well, from Black Lives Matter and from racial justice movements. Just because there's a law on the books does not mean that it's going to actually be implemented in a fair and appropriate way, in a just way for all communities. And this is what women experience, including the United States. It's not uncommon for a woman to try to bring a charge, and the police may come and try to talk the parties into being more peaceful and maybe not filing anything, or the system simply doesn't work because courts are backlogged. Like in Pakistan, this is a huge problem. You may not have your case heard for an incredible amount of time, and so essentially there is a law, maybe you're bringing a case for it, but it's not going to be heard, or then you get a judge that actually doesn't rule with an appropriate punishment. And in the meantime, sometimes people in that community, family members, can try to work out a deal amongst themselves. Maybe a faith leader comes by and says, hey, this isn't really good for our community. Let's just all just agree to forgive and forget. And that's not justice.
So I wondered if maybe I could ask you to sort of round us out here by giving an example of where you think the Me Too movement has really made a significant difference, either from something you talk about in the book or outside your own personal experience. And then maybe a reach that it hasn't quite got to yet, but that you'd like to see. So let's end on a victory, and then the next victory.
Well, one victory of the Me Too movement is that the new 21st century tools that are being used in this digital wave of the movement have diversified the movement. Anyone who has access to an internet connection can join in, and has joined in many cases. And that's helped women find new strength in numbers, but it has also allowed the movement to become more diverse and powerful and far-reaching than at any point in history. In prior eras of the women's movement, it was often women who were privileged, who were able to take the lead, to be heard. Today, the internet has become, in many cases, a 21st century public square for women, particularly in places where freedom is circumscribed and women can't gather safely in public, but they can post anonymously online. So that diversity of the movement has really made it stronger than at any point before. In terms of where we need to go, one of the areas that we highlight in terms of the agenda for the future that we'd like to see is women's representation. Activists at the forefront of the movement are not only demanding a change in laws and policies, they're also demanding a seat at decision-making tables. Too often, the people who are making policy are neither women nor are they survivors. And so to many local activists, gender parity and representation is really a precondition to fixing the power imbalances that have allowed leaders to turn a blind eye to sexual harassment and abuse for centuries. And we're starting to see that happen. For example, in Brazil, we write about how women transformed campaigns against sexual harassment into campaigns for political power, leading to, in 2016 and then subsequently in 2018, the largest number of Brazilian women elected. And not just any women, but Afro-Brazilian women in particular, who historically had been dramatically underrepresented, even though they comprise a third of the population. So we're starting to see that change take place, but it is only when we see a gender balanced decision-making table that we will start to see problems like sexual harassment and abuse adequately addressed.
I have a lot of faith in the future because of the women that we profile and chronicle in the book. Like, these women are endlessly creative, they are endlessly courageous, and they've got so much raw hustle. You know, I think of women like Fakria Hashem, who was in the northern part of Nigeria, who's facing Boko Haram threats, who's dealing with overwhelming expectations in terms of cultural prescriptions for women. And she basically starts organizing on WhatsApp with other young women. They're getting harassed, they're getting threatened, they get jailed. They're still going. They're still going. Like, they deserve our support. They deserve our investment. I think of women in another part of the world, in Saudi Arabia, women like Lujain Al-Hafloul. She was one of the women who was organizing to get the right to drive, and one of the women that Mohammed bin Sultan, MBS, imprisoned for doing so. You know, and I do believe that her case and her ultimate release, although she's still dealing with retribution from that government, I think is also due to the Me Too movement. I don't think that the world would have paid as much attention to a jailed woman human rights defender, and also her allegations that she was sexually tortured. It turns out by some of the same people, it's alleged, that actually killed Jamal Khashoggi. So, I mean, I think there's real linkages here that are coming forward that wouldn't have happened. I don't think this would have gotten the same attention. So I think the future is bright. I think this movement's just getting started. And we hope that when people read this book, they'll want to bet on and believe and support the same women that we do, that we had the privilege of getting to know.
Well, that is awesome. Thank you both so much for joining The Current and for sharing the awakening with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Hachette,